Mr. Speaker, sir, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Now, in the standing orders, it was very clearly stated that each member should only have the entitlement of one question. But if you study the question paper very carefully, he has detailed more than 15 questions in 4 subsections, and therefore I doubt the English comprehension ability of this member. But nevertheless, let me please address the questions that he has posed.
Order, order.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, sir. The questions posed by the member are extensive and require detailed explanation, and therefore I seek your indulgence. Sir, it is wrong of the member to assume that corruption in the civil service is going to become more prevalent simply because there are 2 former senior officials currently undergoing an investigation. As it stands, corruption in the civil service has been consistently low. We should treat these cases as isolated instances that are aberrations of the norm. The Singapore civil service has always been an exemplar of integrity and will continue to do so. Sir, I would like the member to clarify what conflict of interest he is referring to. In fact, I dare say that his usage of the term implies that he is making a speculation on investigations being carried out as we speak. I have heard the involvement of a particular woman in this case, but we should not speculate on whether this was a conflict of interest. Now, as far as objective facts are concerned, it is established that Mr. Peter Lim and Mr. Ng Boon Gay had a close working relationship with her. I will not comment further, I will let the investigation take its course, because it is premature to assume that Mr. Lim and Mr. Ng would be ultimately liable for any criminal proceedings. I say let the CPIB do their job, and Singapore will know the truth in due course. In general, the CPIB will carry out its work in accordance with how it has done so in the past. The ongoing investigations do not signify that there will be an increase in intensity in the investigations. As I have said, the CPIB will carry out the investigations as required, as they deem fit, and at their discretion. The member should clarify what he means by the term systemic failure with regard to the procurement system. This is actually a serious term which, in my view, means the malfunction of the entire procurement system. Let me assure this House that the system is working as it should. Mr. Speaker, sir, in the case of the MHA, it follows a tender and procurement process set out by the Finance Ministry. The tenders are published in the GE BIZ portal for the information of all potential tenderers. Questions are called for purchases not exceeding $70,000, and tenders are called for purchases above $70,000. The level of approving authority varies with the value of the purchase. Quotations are then evaluated and approved by the respective home team departments. The tender bids are received and evaluated by a tender evaluation committee, which then submits its recommendation to a tenders board for approval. Tenders between $70,000 and up to $1 million are approved by a tenders board comprising 3 senior officials from the home team department. Tenders above $1 million are approved by a higher level tenders board comprising MHA headquarters, senior management, and a senior officer from the home team department. The tenders are evaluated independently based on their own merits. For both quotations and tenders, there are segregation of roles between the officers evaluating the quotations or tenders, as well as the officers approving them. Regular audits are also carried out to ensure compliance. With a comprehensive system of check and balances in the procurement system, the only variable factor is human nature. Whether or not Mr. Ng or Mr. Lim have made decisions to benefit themselves remain unclear. Therefore, the member is against speculating that they have manipulated the system to enrich themselves. Sir, the Ministry of Finance gave a clean bill of health for the procurement rules and guidelines for the public sector, following a comprehensive review after the Singapore Land Authority fraud case. The review included a comparison with the best practices in the private sector, and the review affirmed that the public sector procurement rules and guidelines were fundamentally sound. Therefore, there is no need to relook or revamp the existing system just because of the recent occurrence. However, this does not mean that the Ministry of Finance or the CPIB will not be making recommendations to improve the system. They will do so over time. Government agencies have the flexibility to put in place additional safeguards to address their specific needs and vulnerabilities. Now, the member has said that there's a perceived conflict of interest between the CPIB and the Prime Minister's office. There is no conflict of interest at all, even though the CPIB is directly responsible to the Prime Minister. The Prevention of Corruption Act is designed with a presidential safeguard. Now, according to Section 3, subsection 1 of the Prevention of Corruption Act, The President may appoint the Director of the CPIB if he disagrees with the recommendation of the Cabinet. The President may also appoint a Deputy Director and other Assistant Directors and Special Investigators at his discretion. Therefore, presidential appointment of the CPIB Directors and Auxiliary Directors is in fact a guarantee of independence in setting the leadership of the CPIB, and therefore there is transparency, there is accountability. The CPIB is under the PMO because the PMO is the central organ of the Singapore Civil Service. There is no executive office higher than the Prime Minister's office, under which these functions should be coordinated, because the only office higher is that of the President's. Now, and you know the Constitution very well, that the President's executive powers are heavily curtailed, very limited, because the nature of his office is a custodial one. Therefore, the responsibility of maintaining the integrity of the civil service via the CPIB and matters of government should lie with the PMO. Being under the Prime Minister's office does not mean that the CPIB cannot conduct investigations at the ministerial level. There have been several cases, and I shall now educate the Shadow Home Affairs Minister because he's of his ignorance. Tan Kia Gian, then Minister for National Development, was investigated in August 1966 for attempting to help his close businessman friend Lim Jin Hao and his son William Lim to clinch the sale of Boeing aircraft to Malaysian Airways. He also acted as an intermediary for his brother-in-law in the sale of a tin mine to Lim. Tan Kia Gian was administratively stripped of all his public appointments by the government. Strike one. One of the most high-profile investigations pertained to Mr. Teh Cheang Wan, another Minister for National Development. Teh Cheang Wan was investigated in 1986 for accepting 2 bribes of $500,000 each from Hock Tat Development Private Limited and Ho Yao Kun of Kek Sing Private Limited in 1981 and in 1982 respectively. Once investigations were underway, Teh Cheang Wan committed suicide before he could be formally charged in court, attesting to his amount of shame. Wee Toon Boon, then Minister of State for Environment, was charged for corruption involving $839,023 in April 1975. He used his official capacity to make representation to civil servants on behalf of Lau Jin Ho, then Chairman of Lau and Sons Private Limited. In return, Wee Toon Boon was rewarded with a bungalow worth $532,000, galvanized roofing for his home worth $3,500, free air tickets for him and his family to Indonesia, and bank overdrafts totaling $300,000 to speculate in shares. He was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years imprisonment and ordered to pay a penalty of $7,023. Sir, the fact that ministers have been investigated and charged proves that the CPIB is capable of functioning and investigating ministers for corruption. In doing so, ministers have been made accountable and responsible to the public. In the words of our first Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, there is no way a minister can avoid investigations and a trial if there is evidence to support one. The current investigations reaffirm this stance. They show that the government will take firm and decisive action regardless of the position or the seniority of the officer. The simple answer to whether it should be business as usual in the civil service is yes. Because even though these investigations are very serious, they have not crippled the functioning of the civil service in Singapore. That is why the ministry has appointed Mr. Eric Yap Wee Teck and Mr. Ng Se Song to assume command of the SCDF and the CNB respectively, with effect from 1st February 2012. This is to ensure that leadership continuity of both organizations is in place, and therefore it will be business as usual. As to whether there should be a stricter code of conduct internal discipline mechanism, I do not think it is yet necessary to go beyond the current punishments in the Prevention of Corruption Act. Sir, pursuant to Section 5, 6, and 7 of the Prevention of Corruption Act, the maximum penalty is $100,000, but the prison terms may vary between 5 and 7 years. These terms are heavy prices to pay for any civil servant charged of corruption, and they are sufficient deterrents on their own. By asking if the transfers of key personnel at the higher levels are due to misconduct, the member is accusing the civil service of a lack of integrity and that the civil service practices cover up for misdemeanor. I would like to ask the member to substantiate these claims. Does he have irrefutable proof to back up his claims? No answer, so that settles the point. Sir, Professor Eugene Tan said that corruption cases happen because they involve human weaknesses in human nature. But what is more important, sir, is the political will for zero tolerance and the determination to enforce tough anti-corruption laws. The determination to prosecute without fear or favor thus enhance Singapore's reputation for clean governance. These are the principles upon which the Singapore government and the Singapore civil service have been built on, and they therefore remain pillars of our philosophy. Sir, our SCDF and CMB officers are great men and women who put themselves at the fore of Singapore's safety and security every day. They and the rest of the civil service have my full support and continued confidence. Thank you, sir, for allowing me the extensions of time in providing a comprehensive answer.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Ms. Charis Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This question is directed to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. I'd like to ask what is the government's position in the context of increasingly acrimonious relations between US and China. The government's foreign policy seems primarily geared towards generating more economic opportunities for the country, even though our economic partnerships with the rest of the world are already well entrenched. There is, however, no mention of the government's policy towards the US-China issue, despite it being the most pressing diplomatic concern at present. I have observed that Singapore is engaging USA in defense partnerships as a counterbalance to Chinese aggressiveness in the South China Sea, and is worried that such cozy relations with the US would antagonize China and consequently have negative economic side effects, given that China is our largest trading partner. More dangerous still is that if USA and China were to break out into a full-fledged conflict, Singapore's security would be greatly compromised and we are likely to be caught in the crossfire. Does the Minister agree that striking a strategic balance between the two superpowers, as opposed to the government's current policy of a pro-US stance, would better serve Singapore's interest? Thank you.
Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, sir, thank you for the question. I'd like to restate that the Singapore government acknowledges that there is tense relations with respect to USA and China. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the fact that whatever recent trends in Southeast Asia that has occurred because of China and US affect Singapore directly or indirectly. It is easy to come up or predict conflict in the Sino-American disagreements, maybe stemming from problems of trade, the value of yen, their militaries and navies, or even human rights. But while the security dilemma is a valid concern in Sino-American relations, it would only be myopic and a slanted view to expect these states to open full-fledged conflict. To highlight the asker's question, if US-China is to break out in a full-fledged conflict, which I don't think would happen anytime soon. Mr. Speaker, sir, the reasons are very simple. It's more likely that China and US would continue diplomatic talks and dialogues rather than open military combat. Strategic dialogue has always been upheld, and both China and US are tied in a web of economic interdependence despite their disagreements, such that they would not want to jeopardize whatever stability that they have currently. States, and Singapore included, should and do have the foresight not to engage in anything that would actually jeopardize their position. And with US already entrenched in the region, with China also learning how to win friends, it has called for greater efforts towards peace and stability in the region. Foreign relations is not something that could be earned overnight. At the same time, expanding this argument, we go back to the idea of how consultative engagement and strategic dialogue exists among these powers and Southeast Asia itself, which Singapore firmly believes in. The US itself will need to be motivated no more than common sense to increase its diplomatic efforts to prevent any conflict of this sort. The bigger question here is on what grounds does the member assume that Singapore is pro-US? How do you define pro-US? We are pragmatic, we have to be friends with all and make many of them. We have cooperative agreements with both China and US, and it would be foolish of us to outwardly endorse one over the other. Can the member shed light on what policies or instances we are pro-US, but discount the importance of China in our relations? All states are important to Singapore's prosperity and survival. We are not a lone island, but one that exists by the interplay and interdependence of cooperative relations. This leads to my next point, which I am uneasy with the question posed. She is worried that cozy relations with US would consequently have negative side effects, given that China is our largest trading partner. Is she discounting the fact that US is also our major trading partner and investor into Singapore? And assuming we do have cozy relations with the US at the expense of opportunities with China, it should be in the interest of all states involved to ensure the maximization of benefits reaped in. Mr. Speaker, sir, our foreign policy is one that ties states closer to us to ensure maximum cooperation, interaction, and mutual benefits. Like the dynamic changes seen in the region and in the world, and if the member is concerned about these changes, then she should not ignore the importance of economic opportunities that has been put forth, and partnerships that are the stepping stone to closer relations in cooperation and ultimately contributing to peace within the region. I believe that the member has not analysed the situation in its full totality and assumes a direct, over-assuming causal relationship without considering the greater concerns and greater calculations that has to be made in dealing among states. Singapore's security should not be compromised, and it is in the best interest of all states and my counterparts to settle any possible disputes as peacefully as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.